Hello, I'm James Macquarie, one of the founders at GLAD. This is our Breaking Down Climate Pollution podcast, in which we ask AI to generate a deep dive conversation based on a climate science or policy document we'd like to learn more about. In this episode, we ask the AI to take a deep dive into the Science Based Targets Initiative's monitoring report for 2022. Highlighting a significant surge in the companies setting science-based emission targets. With a remarkable 1,097 companies now validated, they represent an impressive 34% of the global economy by market capitalization. Let's dive in.
All right, everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a big one. Are companies actually walking the walk on climate change, or is it all just talk?
Right, greenwashing is a big concern these days.
Exactly. So we're digging into the data on science-based emissions targets. How many businesses are setting them? Are they actually following through? And we got to bring the receipts.
Oh, we've got them. We're diving deep into the SBTi monitoring report for 2022. It's got all the juicy details.
Love it. No sugarcoating here, just the facts. So first up, how many companies are actually jumping on board with this whole science-based approach? Are we talking a handful of eco-warriors, or is there a real movement happening?
Well, get this. 2022 is like the year of the science-based target. A record-breaking 1,097 companies got their emissions reduction targets validated by the SBTi.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal, right?
It's huge. Has more companies than all the previous years combined. We're not just talking about growth. This is exponential.
Okay, now those are some impressive numbers, but let's talk real-world impact for a sec. How much of the global economy do these companies actually represent?
All right, so get this. Those companies, and this includes the ones still in the process, now represent a solid 34% of the global economy by market capitalization. That's a big chunk of change.
34%, that's significant, but if my math is right, that means a whole lot of companies are still on the sidelines.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's about 66% that haven't made that concrete commitment yet. It highlights this gap, like we're making progress, but there's still a long way to go.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? But this is what I found really interesting. Japan is totally crushing it on this front. They're leading the pack when it comes to adopting these targets, even surpassing the US and UK. Did that surprise you?
I'll admit, I was a little surprised. I mean, the US and UK have always been frontrunners, but the momentum in Asia, it's really something.
So they're not just jumping on the bandwagon, they're driving it.
Yeah, and it's not just Japan. Asia as a whole saw a massive surge, 127% increase year over year in companies setting targets. We're even seeing progress in Africa and Latin America, which is incredible.
That's really encouraging, especially in those regions where economic growth and environmental protection haven't always gone hand in hand. Seems like there's a real global shift happening here.
It's definitely a trend we'll be watching closely.
Okay, so we've got more companies setting these science-based targets, but let's talk about the targets themselves. Are we talking baby steps, or are companies ready to really go all in on this climate action thing?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And the good news is the report shows companies aren't just dipping their toes in the water here. Almost 4 out of 5 companies with these targets are aiming for that ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway.
That's a pretty big deal, right? Why is that 1.5 degree mark so important?
It's the level of warming that scientists have been saying, like, this is the line in the sand. We need to stay below this to avoid some of the worst, most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So to see companies embracing that goal, it shows they're really understanding the urgency. They're listening to the science.
It's like they're finally on the same page as the scientists, which is good. Now, the report also digs into this whole Scope 3 emissions thing, which honestly can sound a little intimidating.
It can seem complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So you've got Scope 1 emissions, and those are the direct emissions from a company's operations. Think like factories, company cars.
Okay, so that's their own direct footprint.
Exactly. Scope 2 covers the emissions from the energy they buy, like the electricity to power those factories. But Scope 3, this is where it gets interesting and a lot more complex. Those are all the indirect emissions, the ones that happen across a company's entire value chain.
So not just what they're directly responsible for, but the ripple effects of their business.
You got it. So we're talking everything from the emissions released when extracting and transporting the raw materials they use, to the emissions from when their products are shipped out, used by us, the consumers, even how they're disposed of at the end of their life. It's a big deal.
It's like the true cost of doing business, environmentally speaking. So are companies even trying to tackle this Scope 3 beast?
Get this, 96% of companies, at least the ones with targets, excluding the smaller companies and financial institutions, 96% are now including Scope 3 in their goals. This is huge because for a long time, these emissions were kind of like this hidden problem, you know?
Okay, so I'm seeing some pretty impressive progress here. Companies setting ambitious targets, tackling those tricky Scope 3 emissions. But this is a deep dive, so I'm going to guess there's a but coming here somewhere.
Well, you know me too well. While there's a lot to be optimistic about, there was one trend in the report that we need to keep an eye on. The overall emissions from companies with these targets, they actually went up a little bit in 2021 compared to 2020.
Wait, hold up. I thought we were talking about reductions, not increases. What's going on here?
Don't panic just yet. First of all, those emissions are still lower than 2019 levels, which is important to remember. And one possible reason for this is the post-COVID rebound. As economies reopened, we saw this surge in activity and demand, and that naturally leads to more emissions in the short term.
So maybe a temporary blip because of, well, the whole COVID roller coaster.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something we'll be watching closely. Will companies double down on those commitments and make up for this, or will this become a trend?
So we're cautiously optimistic for now. But let's be real. Even with the best intentions, tracking emissions across an entire value chain, especially Scope 3, that's got to be incredibly difficult. How do we even know companies are actually walking the walk here and not just talking a good game? It's like, how do you even begin to hold these huge companies accountable when their impact is so spread out?
Transparency? That's the key. You can have all these targets, but if there's no accountability, they're meaningless. Companies have got to be open about how they're doing, even when things get tough, even when they hit bumps in the road. That's where reporting comes in.
Okay, so reporting, that's how we know if they're actually making progress, right? What's the report card say? Are they being upfront with their data?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. Most companies with these science-based targets, they are publicly reporting their data in some form, which is a good start, don't get me wrong.
Okay. They're willing to share, that's something. But are we getting the full picture? Like, are they being totally transparent?
That's where it gets a little iffy. See, while most of them are reporting something, only about half are actually giving us data that's truly transparent, data that we can compare across the board. It makes it really tough to see how they're really performing against those goals they set.
So how do we fix that? How do we move past this just trust us thing to real transparency, the kind that actually holds these companies accountable?
This is where it gets interesting, where we all come in. It can't just be the SBTi or governments trying to enforce things. It takes stakeholders, investors, consumers like you and me, even employees. We've all got leverage.
So it's about putting pressure on them from all sides.
Exactly. The SBTi is pushing for better standards, consistent ways to measure things, the whole shebang. But honestly, it's public pressure that really gets things moving. When investors start demanding climate action, when consumers, when people like us choose products from companies with solid climate plans, when employees start holding their own companies accountable, that speaks volumes.
So this is where we, the listeners, consumers, just people who care, this is where we have the power to make a difference. We can ask the tough questions, support the companies who are actually walking the walk, and let's be honest, make it a little uncomfortable for those who aren't.
It's about putting our money where our mouth is, literally, and using our voices to demand better. Every little bit counts, every choice, every question.
A lot to think about. This deep dive, it was about more than just targets and numbers on a page. It's about realizing we have the power to push for real, meaningful change. If the big players aren't moving fast enough, well, it's on us to give them a nudge, or maybe a shove, to create a world where sustainability isn't some trendy thing, but just how we do business, period.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future, it depends on us being informed, being bold, and speaking up. Together.
Couldn't agree more. Until next time, everyone, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions. It's been great diving in with you all.